What happens when someone assumes they know exactly who you are based on your appearance? What happens when 4 trained military personnel decide to test someone they believe is weak, only to discover they've made the biggest mistake of their lives? This is the true story of Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a woman whose quiet presence in the Navy mess hall masked one of the most dangerous skill sets in the entire military. For recruits thought they had found an easy target. They thought wrong. In just 45 seconds, everything they believed about strength, courage, and what it means to be a warrior would be shattered forever. This isn't just a story about a fight. It's about the moment when assumptions collide with reality, when prejudice meets precision, and when 4 young men learned the most important lesson of their military careers. Some stories stay buried in classified files. Some heroes never get the recognition they deserve. But today, you're about to discover what really happened that Tuesday evening in the USS Nimitz mess hall, and why those 45 seconds changed everything for everyone involved. The truth is always more incredible than fiction. And Sarah Chen's truth is about to blow your mind. Lieutenant Sarah Chen sat alone at the corner table in the USS Nimitz mess hall, methodically eating her dinner while reviewing mission reports on her tablet. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 130 pounds, she looked like she could be blown over by a strong wind. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform hung loosely on her small frame. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another Navy officer grabbing a quiet meal after a long day. What they couldn't see was the network of scars hidden beneath her sleeves, each one telling a story of missions that officially never happened. They couldn't see the calluses on her hands from thousands of hours of weapons training, or the way her eyes constantly swept the room, cataloging every entrance, every potential threat, every escape route. They couldn't know that this seemingly fragile woman had spent the last 8 years completing operations in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Sarah Chen was a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women to ever complete the grueling training program. But tonight, in the brightly lit mess hall filled with hundreds of sailors, she was trying to be invisible. The USS Nimitz was currently docked at Naval Station Norfolk for routine maintenance, and the ship was crawling with new recruits fresh from basic training. These young sailors, mostly men between 18 and 22, were eager to prove themselves and establish their place in the naval hierarchy. They carried themselves with the swagger that comes from surviving boot camp but having never seen real action. Sarah had been observing them all week. She recognized the type immediately. They were hungry for respect, quick to challenge anyone they perceived as weaker, and absolutely convinced that their few months of training made them warriors. She had been exactly like them once, before the Navy had taught her that true strength often came in packages that looked nothing like what people expected. 4 of these recruits had been particularly problematic during their time on the ship. Marcus Williams, a former high school football player from Texas, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 220 pounds of solid muscle. He had joined the Navy after college football didn't work out, and he carried himself like someone who had never met a challenge he couldn't muscle his way through. His 3 friends followed his lead in everything. Jake Morrison from Ohio was the tech guy, smart but lacking confidence, who had attached himself to Marcus for protection. Tommy Rodriguez from California was the joker of the group, always looking for attention and laughs. And David Park from New York was the quiet one who went along with whatever the others decided, desperate to fit in somewhere. These 4 had spent their week on the Nimitz making life difficult for anyone they considered beneath them. They had harassed junior sailors, made crude comments to female personnel, and generally acted like they owned the ship. Most of the crew had learned to avoid them, and the few complaints that had been filed had mysteriously disappeared thanks to Marcus's father, who happened to be a rear admiral with significant influence. Sarah had watched their behavior with growing disgust, but she had been specifically ordered to maintain a low profile during her time on the ship. She was officially listed as a communications officer, and her SEAL status was classified information known only to a handful of senior officers. Her presence on the Nimitz was temporary, a brief stopover before her next deployment to a location that didn't officially exist. But staying invisible was becoming increasingly difficult as the 4 recruits grew bolder with each passing day. They seemed to target anyone they perceived as weak or different, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before they set their sights on her. She had been hoping to complete her time on the ship without incident, but deep down, she knew that hope was probably unrealistic. The mess hall was unusually crowded that Tuesday evening. A storm had kept most of the crew aboard ship instead of heading into Norfolk for liberty, and the large dining area buzzed with conversation and laughter. Sarah had chosen her corner table specifically because it offered her a clear view of the entire room while keeping her back to the wall. Old habits from dangerous places died hard. She was halfway through her meal when she noticed Marcus and his crew enter the mess hall. They moved through the food line like they owned the place, cutting in front of younger sailors and making loud comments about everything from the food to the female personnel. Sarah kept her head down and focused on her tablet, hoping they would find other entertainment for the evening. For a while, it looked like her strategy might work. The 4 recruits found seats at a table near the center of the room and spent their time trying to impress a group of female sailors with increasingly outrageous stories about their supposed combat experience. Sarah almost smiled at their obvious lies. These boys had never seen combat, had never faced a real enemy, had never experienced the kind of fear that strips away all pretense and reveals who you really are underneath. But Marcus Williams was the kind of person who needed to dominate every room he entered, and after 20 minutes of failed attempts to impress the women, his attention began to wander. His eyes swept the mess hall looking for new targets, new opportunities to assert his dominance. That's when he spotted Sarah sitting alone in the corner. She felt his gaze before she saw it, that prickly sensation that comes from being watched by someone with bad intentions. When she looked up from her tablet, Marcus was staring directly at her with the kind of predatory smile she had seen on the faces of bullies her entire life. He said something to his friends that she couldn't hear over the noise of the mess hall, but their reaction told her everything she needed to know. All 4 of them turned to look at her, and their expressions made it clear that she had just become their evening's entertainment. Sarah closed her tablet and stood up, hoping to leave before the situation escalated. But, as she moved toward the exit, Marcus and his friends rose from their table and began walking in her direction. They moved with the casual confidence of people who had never faced real consequences for their actions, spreading out slightly to block her path to the door. The mess hall was so crowded and noisy that most people didn't notice what was happening. Those who did see the 4 large men approaching the small woman in the corner either looked away quickly or assumed it was just some harmless flirting. No one intervened. No one moved to help. Sarah was on her own, exactly where she had spent most of her adult life. Marcus reached her first, planting himself directly in her path with a smile that never reached his eyes. His 3 friends flanked him, forming a semicircle that effectively trapped her against the wall. Up close, the size difference was even more dramatic. Marcus towered over her by almost a full foot, and each of his friends outweighed her by at least 60 pounds. Well, Marcus said, his voice loud enough to carry over the ambient noise. What do we have here? You look lost, little girl. This is the officers' mess, not the daycare center. His friends chuckled appreciatively at what they clearly considered a brilliant opening line. Sarah said nothing, her face completely expressionless as she evaluated the situation. 4 opponents, all larger and stronger but untested in real combat. Multiple witnesses who were either ignoring the situation or actively watching for entertainment. 3 possible escape routes, but all of them blocked. I'm talking to you, Marcus said, stepping closer until he was invading her personal space. Didn't they teach you manners in whatever Mickey Mouse program got you those bars on your collar? Sarah looked up at him calmly, her dark eyes revealing nothing of what she was thinking. She had faced down terrorists in Afghan caves, cartel leaders in South American jungles, and human traffickers in Eastern European warehouses. Marcus Williams was not intimidating. He was just another bully who had never learned that real strength had nothing to do with size. I heard you, she said quietly, her voice steady and controlled. I'm trying to leave. Please step aside. Marcus laughed, a sound that was more sneer than genuine humor. Please step aside? Oh, that's cute. She's being polite. He looked back at his friends for approval before continuing. Here's the thing, sweetheart. We run this ship. And, when new people come aboard, especially people who look like they couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag, we like to make sure they understand how things work around here. The conversation was beginning to attract attention from nearby tables. Some sailors had stopped eating to watch the confrontation unfold, while others were pointing and whispering to their companions. Sarah could feel the weight of their stares, but she kept her focus entirely on Marcus and his friends. "I understand perfectly," Sarah replied, her voice still calm but carrying an undertone that would have warned anyone with combat experience to back away immediately. "Now please move so I can leave." Marcus either didn't hear the warning in her voice or chose to ignore it. Instead of backing down, he stepped even closer, now standing directly in front of her with barely 6 inches between them. His friends moved in tighter as well, forming what they clearly thought was an intimidating wall of muscle and testosterone. "See, I don't think you do understand," Marcus said, his voice taking on a nastier edge. "I think you're just another diversity hire who got fast-tracked through some easy program designed to make the Navy look good in the newspapers. I think you're taking up space that should belong to a real sailor. And I think it's time someone taught you exactly where you belong." The mess hall had grown noticeably quieter as more people became aware of the confrontation. Some sailors were actively watching now, while others had their phones out, apparently recording what they thought was going to be an entertaining humiliation. Sarah noticed it all, catalogued it all, but her expression never changed. Jake Morrison, emboldened by the growing audience, decided to join in. "Maybe she needs a lesson in military courtesy," he said with a nervous laugh. "You know, how to show proper respect to her superiors." Tommy Rodriguez added his own contribution, "I bet she's never even seen combat. Probably spent her whole career pushing papers in some air-conditioned office while real sailors did the actual work." David Park said nothing, but his presence in the semicircle made him just as complicit as his more vocal friends. He stood there with his arms crossed, trying to look intimidating while his eyes darted nervously around the room. Sarah remained perfectly still during this exchange, but something subtle had changed in her posture. Her weight had shifted almost imperceptibly onto the balls of her feet. Her hands, which had been hanging casually at her sides, had moved slightly away from her body. Her breathing had become deeper and more controlled. To most observers, she still looked like a small woman being bullied by 4 large men. But anyone with real combat training would have recognized the signs of a predator preparing to strike. "Last chance," Sarah said softly, her voice now carrying an edge that cut through the ambient noise of the mess hall like a blade. "Step aside and let me leave." Marcus Williams had spent his entire life using his size and physical presence to intimidate people into giving him what he wanted. He had been the biggest kid in his neighborhood, the strongest player on his football team, and the most physically imposing recruit in his basic training class. He had never encountered anyone who didn't back down when faced with his size and aggression, especially not someone who looked like they belonged in a high school classroom rather than a military vessel. So when this small woman looked up at him with absolutely no fear in her eyes and made what sounded like a threat, Marcus did what he had always done. He escalated. "Or what?" he said with a laugh, reaching out to grab her shoulder. "What exactly are you going to do about it, little girl?" That was his mistake. The moment Marcus Williams put his hand on Lieutenant Sarah Chen, he crossed a line that activated 8 years of the most intensive combat training the United States military had to offer. He went from dealing with a woman trying to avoid conflict to facing a Navy SEAL who had just been given legal justification to neutralize a threat. The next 45 seconds would change everything for everyone involved. But, at that moment, as Marcus's hand closed on Sarah's shoulder and his 3 friends pressed closer with anticipating grins, none of them had any idea what they had just unleashed. They were about to learn that assumptions about strength, about capability, about what makes someone dangerous, could be not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. The mess hall held its collective breath as the confrontation reached its tipping point. Phones continued recording. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. And, in the corner by the wall, a Navy SEAL who had been trying very hard to remain invisible prepared to remind 4 foolish young men that the most dangerous people are often the ones you never see coming. The moment Marcus Williams's hand touched Sarah Chen's shoulder, everything changed. What had been a tense but relatively controlled situation exploded into violence with a speed and intensity that left everyone in the mess hall stunned. Sarah's response was not emotional or reactive. It was pure muscle memory, the result of thousands of hours of training that had been drilled into her until it became as natural as breathing. The instant she felt unwanted contact from a potential threat, her body moved with the fluid precision of a machine designed for one purpose: neutralizing enemies. Her left hand came up in a sharp arc, striking Marcus's wrist and breaking his grip on her shoulder. Simultaneously, her right hand shot forward, palm strike connecting with his solar plexus with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. The blow was precise, calculated to cause maximum disorientation without permanent damage. Marcus doubled over, gasping for breath, his face turning red as he struggled to understand what had just happened. But Sarah wasn't finished. In the same fluid motion that had freed her from Marcus's grip, she pivoted slightly and drove her elbow back into Jake Morrison's midsection as he moved to grab her from behind. Jake had been reaching for her arms, thinking he could help Marcus restrain the crazy woman, but instead found himself on the receiving end of a strike that felt like being hit by a sledgehammer. He stumbled backward, clutching his ribs, his vision blurring from the pain. Tommy Rodriguez tried to circle around to her left side, thinking he could catch her off balance while she was dealing with his friends. It was a logical tactical decision that might have worked against an untrained opponent. Against Sarah Chen, it was suicide. She sensed his movement without looking, spinning in place and catching his advancing leg with a sweep that sent him crashing to the floor. The sound of his body hitting the ground echoed through the now silent mess hall like a gunshot. David Park, the quiet member of the group, had frozen in shock as his three friends were systematically dismantled in the space of about 5 seconds. He stood there with his mouth open, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They were bigger, stronger, and there were 4 of them. The small woman was supposed to be intimidated, supposed to back down, supposed to know her place. Instead, she was standing in the middle of their group like a tornado in human form, having just disabled 3 trained military personnel with movements so fast and precise that most of the observers hadn't even seen exactly what happened. They just knew that one moment 4 large men had been menacing a small woman, and the next moment 3 of those men were on the ground or doubled over in pain. Sarah turned her attention to David, the only member of the group still standing. Her breathing was completely controlled, her stance balanced and ready. She looked like she had just finished a light warm-up exercise rather than demolishing 3 attackers. David found himself staring into her eyes and seeing something that made his blood run cold. This wasn't anger or rage. This was the calm, professional assessment of a predator deciding whether he represented enough of a threat to warrant further action. "Down," Sarah said quietly, the single word carrying more authority than most people could manage with an entire speech. David Park, who had never been in a real fight in his life, immediately dropped to his knees and put his hands behind his head. Some part of his brain, the part responsible for survival, had recognized that he was completely outmatched and that his only chance of avoiding serious injury was immediate surrender. The entire sequence had taken exactly 12 seconds. 12 seconds to completely reverse a 4-on-1 confrontation and establish total dominance over multiple opponents. The mess hall was dead silent except for the sounds of Marcus wheezing as he slowly straightened up, Jake groaning as he held his ribs, and Tommy trying to get back to his feet from the floor. Marcus Williams was the first to recover enough to fully comprehend what had happened. As his breathing returned to normal and the pain in his chest subsided, he found himself staring at the small woman who had just dismantled his entire crew without breaking a sweat. The humiliation was almost worse than the physical pain. Every assumption he had made about strength, about dominance, about his place in the world had just been shattered by someone who looked like she should be teaching elementary school. But Marcus Williams had not become the alpha male of every group he joined by backing down when challenged. His entire identity was built around being the strongest person in any room, and having that identity destroyed in front of dozens of witnesses was not something he could accept. Instead of recognizing that he had made a terrible mistake and withdrawing while he still could, Marcus made the worst decision of his military career. He decided to escalate. "You crazy bitch!" Marcus roared, his voice cracking slightly from the damage to his throat. "I'm going to destroy you for that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folding knife, a move that transformed the situation from a simple assault into something far more serious. The click of the blade locking open was audible throughout the silent mess hall, and several people gasped in shock. What had been a brawl was now a deadly weapon situation, and everyone present knew that they were witnessing something that could end very badly for everyone involved. But, if Marcus thought that producing a weapon would intimidate Sarah into submission, he was about to learn just how wrong a person could be. The moment she saw the knife, Sarah's entire demeanor changed again. The controlled professional who had been trying to de-escalate the situation disappeared, replaced by something that had been forged in the most dangerous places on Earth. Her stance shifted subtly, weight distributing differently across her feet. Her hands, which had been held in a defensive position, moved into configurations that spoke of weapons training far beyond anything taught in basic military courses. Her eyes, which had been watchful but calm, now held the cold focus of someone who had killed before and was prepared to do so again. "Put the knife down," Sarah said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of command that comes from leading men in combat. "Put it down now and walk away." Marcus was too angry, too humiliated, and too committed to his course of action to recognize that he was being given one last chance to save himself from complete destruction. Instead of heeding the warning in Sarah's voice, he raised the knife and lunged forward, intending to intimidate her into submission or, if necessary, to use the weapon to regain control of the situation. It was the last mistake he would make as a free man. Sarah moved like liquid lightning. Her right hand intercepted Marcus's knife hand at the wrist, controlling the weapon while her left hand drove into his elbow joint. The combined pressure and leverage created a submission hold that forced Marcus to his knees, the knife clattering harmlessly to the floor as his nerveless fingers lost their grip. But Sarah wasn't done. With Marcus controlled and disarmed, she shifted her position and applied a sleeper hold that cut off blood flow to his brain. Marcus struggled for perhaps 3 seconds before his body went limp and he collapsed unconscious to the floor. The entire sequence, from knife attack to unconscious opponent, had taken less than 6 seconds. The mess hall erupted in chaos. Sailors who had been watching the confrontation like it was entertainment suddenly realized they had witnessed something far more serious. Voices rose in excitement, fear, and confusion. Some people were calling for security, others were trying to get closer to see what had happened, and still others were backing away from what they now recognized as a very dangerous situation. Jake Morrison, still clutching his ribs but now fully aware that their easy target was actually some kind of highly trained killer, was frantically trying to distance himself from the unconscious Marcus and the woman who had put him there. Tommy Rodriguez had managed to get back to his feet, but he was swaying unsteadily and looking around like he couldn't quite figure out where he was or how he had gotten there. David Park remained on his knees with his hands behind his head, tears streaming down his face as the full scope of what they had attempted began to sink in. Sarah stood in the center of it all, completely calm despite being surrounded by chaos. She looked down at Marcus's unconscious form, then at his 3 friends, then at the crowd of sailors who were staring at her with expressions ranging from awe to terror. She had blown her cover completely. There was no way to explain away what had just happened, no story that would account for it. Communications officer single-handedly defeating 4 larger opponents, one of whom had been armed. The sound of running feet announced the arrival of the ship's security team, who had been alerted by multiple calls from witnesses to the fight. Master-at-Arms Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez burst through the crowd with 4 junior personnel, all of them expecting to find a typical mess hall brawl between drunk sailors. What they found instead was a scene that none of them had ever encountered before. One sailor was unconscious on the floor. Another was kneeling with his hands behind his head, crying. A third was holding his ribs and looking like he might vomit. The fourth was swaying on his feet with a glazed expression. And, standing over all of them was a small woman in a lieutenant's uniform who looked like she could take on the entire security team without working up a sweat. Chief Rodriguez had been handling shipboard discipline for 15 years, and he had never seen anything like this. The size disparity between the apparent victor and the apparent losers made no sense. The condition of the 4 male sailors suggested they had been on the receiving end of a severe beating, but the woman didn't have a mark on her and wasn't even breathing hard. What the hell happened here? Chief Rodriguez demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm as he tried to assess whether the situation was still dangerous. Sarah turned to face him, and Chief Rodriguez found himself looking into the calmest pair of eyes he had ever seen. This wasn't the face of someone who had just been in a fight. This was the face of someone who had just completed a routine task. "These 4 men assaulted me," Sarah said simply, her voice carrying clearly over the noise of the crowd. "I defended myself." Chief Rodriguez looked around at the scene again, taking in the unconscious sailor, the knife on the floor, and the 3 other men who looked like they had been hit by a truck. He had been expecting to arrest a troublemaking female officer for assaulting male personnel. Instead, he was beginning to realize that he was looking at something else entirely. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm going to need to see some identification, and I'm going to need everyone involved to come with me for questioning." Sarah nodded and reached slowly for her wallet, moving deliberately to avoid any sudden motions that might alarm the security team. She handed over her military ID, and Chief Rodriguez looked at it with growing confusion. According to the card, this was Lieutenant Sarah Chen, listed as a communications officer. But communications officers didn't usually leave 4 men looking like they had been run over by a tank. "Chief Rodriguez," a new voice said from behind him. Everyone turned to see Commander James Patterson, the ship's executive officer, pushing through the crowd. Commander Patterson was a serious man in his 50s who had seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, and his presence meant that word of the incident had already reached the ship's senior leadership. Commander Patterson took in the scene with experienced eyes, noting the positions of the unconscious and injured sailors, the knife on the floor, and the completely composed woman standing in the center of it all. His gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment, and something in his expression suggested recognition. "Lieutenant Chen," Commander Patterson said quietly. "I think we need to have a conversation. Chief Rodriguez, secure the scene and get medical attention for these men. I'll take Lieutenant Chen to my office for debriefing." As the security team moved to secure the knife and check on the injured sailors, Sarah found herself being escorted through the crowd of staring personnel. She could hear fragments of conversation as she passed, witnesses trying to explain to newcomers what they had just seen. The stories were already growing in the telling, and she knew that by tomorrow the entire ship would be buzzing with increasingly exaggerated versions of what had happened in the mess hall. But Sarah's immediate concern wasn't the gossip or the stares. Her concern was that her carefully maintained cover had been blown completely. The mission she had been preparing for, the identity she had been protecting, the low profile she had been ordered to maintain, all of it was gone. In 45 seconds of violence, she had revealed exactly what she was to hundreds of witnesses. As they walked toward Commander Patterson's office, Sarah reflected on the chain of events that had led to this moment. She had been trying to avoid exactly this kind of situation, had been doing everything possible to remain invisible until her deployment orders came through. But sometimes, no matter how carefully you planned or how hard you tried to stay out of trouble, the world forced your hand. Marcus Williams and his friends had made assumptions about her based on her appearance. They had seen a small woman and decided she was weak. They had seen someone trying to avoid conflict and interpreted it as fear. They had mistaken patience for vulnerability and restraint for helplessness. They had been catastrophically wrong about all of it, and now they were paying the price for their assumptions. But Sarah knew that the real consequences were just beginning. What had happened in the mess hall would have repercussions that went far beyond 4 foolish recruits learning a painful lesson about underestimating people. As Commander Patterson's office door closed behind her, Sarah prepared herself for the conversation that would determine whether her military career would survive the next hour. She had defended herself against assault and disarmed a man who had threatened her with a deadly weapon. Everything she had done was legally justified and tactically sound. But she had also revealed capabilities that were supposed to remain classified, had demonstrated skills that didn't match her cover identity, and had created a situation that would require explanations she wasn't authorized to give. The next few hours would determine whether Lieutenant Sarah Chen would continue her mission as planned, or whether the Navy SEAL who had spent years operating in the shadows would finally be forced to step into the light. Commander James Patterson's office was spartanly furnished, with only the essential items that reflected a career spent in active service. Maps covered one wall, military commendations another, and his desk held neat stacks of paperwork that spoke to the endless administrative demands of running a naval vessel. But it was the framed photograph on his desk that caught Sarah's attention as she took the seat he offered, a picture of Commander Patterson in desert fatigues standing next to a group of special operations personnel in an undisclosed location. Commander Patterson noticed her looking at the photograph and smiled grimly. Fallujah, 2006, he said, settling into his chair behind the desk. I was embedded with a SEAL team for a joint operation against high-value targets in the city. Some of the finest warriors I've ever had the privilege to serve alongside. Sarah said nothing, but her posture straightened slightly. Commander Patterson was not making idle conversation. He was establishing that he knew exactly what SEALs were capable of, which meant he had probably recognized what he had witnessed in the mess hall. Lieutenant Chen, Commander Patterson continued, his voice taking on the formal tone of an official debriefing, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened tonight. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out. Sarah took a breath and began her account, sticking strictly to the facts without editorial comment or emotional coloring. She described sitting alone in the mess hall, the 4 recruits approaching her table, their escalating verbal harassment, Marcus Williams grabbing her shoulder, and her subsequent defensive actions. She was particularly careful when describing the moment Marcus had produced the knife, making sure to emphasize that she had given him multiple opportunities to de-escalate before he chose to introduce a deadly weapon. Commander Patterson listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. His expression remained neutral throughout her account, giving no indication of what he was thinking or what consequences might be coming. When Sarah finished her recitation of events, he sat back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. That's a very interesting story, Lieutenant, he said finally. Particularly the part where a communications officer with no listed combat training managed to disable 4 larger opponents in under a minute, one of whom was armed with a knife. Sarah met his gaze steadily but said nothing. They both knew that her official personnel file contained no information that would explain her capabilities, and they both knew that there had to be more to her story than what appeared in the standard Navy records. Commander Patterson opened a folder on his desk and pulled out several documents. I took the liberty of making some calls while Chief Rodriguez was securing the scene, he said. Interesting thing about classified personnel files, they require special authorization to access. But, when you have a situation like what happened tonight, that authorization can be obtained very quickly. He held up the first document, and Sarah could see the red classification markings even from across the desk. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, United States Navy SEALs. 8 years of active service in special operations. Multiple classified deployments to locations I can't even mention in an unsecured office. Decorations for valor that will never be made public. And currently assigned to temporary duty aboard this vessel while awaiting deployment to another classified location. Sarah's expression didn't change, but internally she was calculating the implications of her cover being blown at the highest levels. Her mission parameters would have to be reassessed, her security clearance might be compromised, and her next deployment could be delayed or cancelled entirely. The question, Commander Patterson continued, is what we do about the fact that your classified status has just been revealed to several hundred witnesses, some of whom undoubtedly recorded the incident on their phones. Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock on the office door. Commander Patterson called for them to enter, and Chief Rodriguez appeared with a tablet in his hand and a bewildered expression on his face. Sir, Chief Rodriguez said, I've completed the preliminary interviews with the witnesses and the injured personnel. I think you need to hear this. Commander Patterson gestured for him to continue, and Chief Rodriguez consulted his tablet before speaking. Marcus Williams, the one who was unconscious, is claiming that Lieutenant Chen attacked them without provocation. He says they were just trying to have a friendly conversation with her when she went crazy and assaulted all 4 of them. And the others? Commander Patterson asked. Jake Morrison and Tommy Rodriguez are backing up Williams's story. They claim they were trying to be friendly and she attacked them for no reason. But, here's the thing, Sir David Park, the 4th member of the group, is telling a completely different story. Chief Rodriguez swiped to another screen on his tablet. According to Park, Williams has been planning to teach the uppity female officers a lesson since they came aboard. Park says Williams specifically targeted Lieutenant Chen because she was small and alone, and that Williams grabbed her first. Park also confirms that Williams pulled a knife during the altercation. Commander Patterson nodded thoughtfully. What about the witnesses? That's where it gets interesting, sir. Most of the witnesses were too far away to hear the conversation, but they all confirmed that the four men approached Lieutenant Chen's table and surrounded her. Multiple witnesses saw Williams grab her shoulder, and at least 6 people saw him pull a knife. The consensus is that Lieutenant Chen was defending herself against multiple attackers, one of whom was armed. Chief Rodriguez paused and looked between Commander Patterson and Sarah. "Sir, there's something else. I've been checking the records of these 4 recruits, and Williams in particular has a history of disciplinary issues that have been swept under the rug. His father is Rear Admiral Williams from Naval Personnel Command, and it appears that Marcus has been getting special treatment despite multiple complaints about his behavior." Commander Patterson's expression darkened. "What kind of complaints?" "Sexual harassment, mostly. Female personnel filing reports that disappear from the system. Junior sailors reporting intimidation and assault that never gets investigated. Williams has been using his father's influence to avoid consequences for increasingly serious misconduct." Sarah spoke for the first time since beginning her formal statement. "Sir, if I may ask, what's the status of the 4 men?" Chief Rodriguez consulted his tablet again. "Williams has a mild concussion but is otherwise uninjured. Morrison has bruised ribs but no breaks. Rodriguez has a possible mild concussion from hitting the deck, but he's coherent and responsive. Park is physically uninjured but appears to be in shock." "And their current status?" Commander Patterson answered this question. "They're all confined to quarters pending a full investigation. Williams will face charges for assault with a deadly weapon, at minimum. The others will face charges for assault and conspiracy, depending on what the investigation reveals." The room fell silent as all 3 of them contemplated the implications of the situation. Sarah had defended herself against assault and had used exactly the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat she faced. Her actions were legally justified and tactically sound. But her classified status had been compromised, and there would inevitably be questions about why a Navy SEAL had been operating undercover aboard a ship full of conventional Navy personnel. Commander Patterson seemed to read her thoughts. "Lieutenant, I want you to know that from my perspective, you did exactly what any properly trained military professional should have done when faced with assault and a deadly weapon threat. The fact that you possess the skills necessary to handle the situation effectively is not a problem, it's an asset." He leaned forward in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. "However, we do have a problem with operational security. Your status as a SEAL is classified information, and it's now known to potentially hundreds of people. That's going to require some damage control." Chief Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Sir, if I may make a suggestion? The witness statements are pretty consistent that Lieutenant Chen was defending herself against multiple attackers. If we focus the official report on the self-defense aspect and emphasize Williams's use of a deadly weapon, we might be able to control the narrative somewhat." Commander Patterson nodded. "That's a good point. What are you thinking?" "Well, sir, the average sailor doesn't really know what SEALs are capable of. They know SEALs are elite, but they don't understand the specifics of the training or capabilities. If we present this as a case of superior military training overcoming multiple untrained attackers, it becomes a story about proper preparation and self-defense rather than about classified capabilities." Sarah considered this approach. It had merit, but it also had potential complications. "Sir, there's still the issue of the video recordings. Some of those sailors were definitely filming the incident, and if that footage gets shared on social media or with the press, it could create a much larger problem." Commander Patterson picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Master Chief Henderson? I need you to implement a communications blackout for all personnel who were in the mess hall tonight. All phones and personal electronic devices are to be confiscated immediately for security review. Anyone who has already posted content about tonight's incident to social media needs to take it down immediately." He listened for a moment, then continued. "Yes, I understand it's unusual, but we have a potential security breach that requires immediate containment. Brief the senior enlisted leadership and get it done within the hour." After hanging up, Commander Patterson turned back to Sarah. That should buy us some time to develop a proper response strategy. But, I need to ask, is there anything else about your background or mission that I should know? Anything that might complicate this situation further? Sarah hesitated for a moment, weighing how much she could reveal without violating her security oath. Sir, my presence on this ship is temporary. I'm awaiting transport to my next assignment, which is classified. My cover identity as a communications officer was intended to maintain operational security until that transport could be arranged. And, now that your cover is blown? That depends on what my chain of command decides, sir. This incident will have to be reported up through SEAL Command, and they'll make the determination about whether my operational effectiveness has been compromised. Commander Patterson nodded grimly. I'll need to make some calls to ensure that your chain of command gets a complete picture of what happened here. From my perspective, you acted appropriately in defending yourself against assault. The fact that you possess exceptional defensive capabilities is not something you should be punished for. Chief Rodriguez spoke up again. Sir, there's one more thing. Williams is demanding to file charges against Lieutenant Chun. He's claiming she used excessive force and that her actions were unjustified. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. Marcus Williams had attacked her with 3 accomplices, had grabbed her against her will, and had threatened her with a knife. Now he wanted to claim that her defensive actions had been excessive. Commander Patterson's expression showed what he thought of Williams's demands. Mr. Williams is free to file whatever charges he wants. However, he'll have to explain to a military tribunal why he thought it was appropriate to assault a fellow officer and threaten her with a deadly weapon. I suspect his legal position is not as strong as he believes. The commander stood up from his desk, indicating that the initial debriefing was concluded. Lieutenant Chen, you're confined to quarters pending a full investigation, but that's standard procedure in any incident involving potential charges. Chief Rodriguez will escort you to your berth and ensure that you have everything you need. As Sarah stood to leave, Commander Patterson added one final comment. Lieutenant, for what it's worth, I've seen a lot of military personnel in my career, and I've rarely seen someone handle a dangerous situation with the professionalism and restraint you showed tonight. Whatever happens with the investigation, you should be proud of how you conducted yourself. As they left Commander Patterson's office, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in the space of a few hours. This morning, she had been an anonymous officer awaiting her next classified deployment. Tonight, she was the center of an investigation that could potentially end her career or, conversely, expose capabilities that the Navy preferred to keep secret. But, as they walked through the corridors of the USS Nimitz, Sarah noticed something interesting. The sailors they passed looked at her with expressions of respect rather than fear. Word had spread quickly through the ship about what had happened in the mess hall, and the consensus seemed to be that she had handled herself admirably against overwhelming odds. One young female sailor actually stopped and saluted as they passed, a gesture of respect that was technically unnecessary but clearly heartfelt. Sarah returned the salute and continued on her way, beginning to realize that while her cover might be blown, her reputation among the ship's crew was actually enhanced by the night's events. Marcus Williams and his friends had made the mistake of underestimating her based on her appearance and gender. They had assumed that size and numbers would give them an overwhelming advantage. They had been wrong about all of it, and their mistake had cost them dearly. But, as Sarah settled into her quarters to await the results of the investigation, she knew that the real test was still to come. Her actions had been legally justified and tactically sound, but the military bureaucracy was not always guided by logic or fairness. The fact that Marcus Williams's father was a rear admiral could complicate things significantly, regardless of what the evidence showed. The next 24 hours would determine whether Lieutenant Sarah Chen's career would continue on its current trajectory, or whether the events in the mess hall would mark the beginning of an entirely new chapter in her life. Either way, she had no regrets about her actions. When faced with assault and a deadly weapon threat, she had done exactly what her training had taught her to do. She had survived, and her attackers had learned a lesson they would never forget. Sometimes, that was the best outcome you could hope for. The next morning brought a flurry of activity that rippled through every level of the naval command structure. What had begun as a simple mess hall altercation had evolved into something far more complex, involving classified personnel, potential criminal charges, and the kind of political complications that made admirals lose sleep. Sarah woke to find Master Chief Henderson standing outside her quarters with a breakfast tray and news that would reshape the entire investigation. "Lieutenant Chen," he said as he handed her the tray, "you've got visitors coming aboard at 0800. Two officers from Naval Special Warfare Command and someone from the Judge Advocate General's office. Looks like this situation has attracted some serious attention." Sarah thanked him for the information and the breakfast, her mind already working through the implications. Naval Special Warfare Command didn't send representatives unless there were significant operational security concerns, and JAG involvement suggested that someone was taking the potential criminal charges very seriously. The fact that both offices were sending people meant that her case had become a priority at levels far above a simple ship's investigation. At precisely 0800, Commander Patterson's office became the center of a meeting that would determine the trajectory of Sarah's career and the fate of the four men who had made the mistake of confronting her. The participants included Commander Patterson himself, Captain Morrison, the ship's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Davis from JAG, Captain Rodriguez from Naval Special Warfare Command, and Commander Thompson, who served as Marcus Williams's father's representative. Sarah was brought into the meeting after the preliminary discussions had established the basic facts of the case. As she entered the room, she could feel the weight of multiple competing interests and agendas converging on her situation. This wasn't just about whether she had acted appropriately in defending herself, it was about protecting operational security, managing political fallout, and balancing the competing demands of military justice and special operations requirements. Captain Rodriguez, a compact man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in special operations, spoke first. "Lieutenant Chen, I've reviewed your service record and the preliminary reports of last night's incident. From a special warfare perspective, your actions appear to have been entirely appropriate given the circumstances. However, we have significant concerns about the operational security implications of this incident." Lieutenant Commander Davis, a sharp-eyed woman who looked like she could dissect legal arguments with surgical precision, consulted her tablet before speaking. "Lieutenant, before we proceed, I need to advise you of your rights. While you're not currently facing formal charges, statements you make in this meeting could potentially be used in any future legal proceedings. You have the right to remain silent and the right to legal representation." Sarah nodded her understanding. "Ma'am, I waive my right to silence and choose to participate fully in this investigation. I have nothing to hide regarding my actions last night." Commander Thompson, a thin man with the look of someone more comfortable in Washington conference rooms than aboard naval vessels, leaned forward in his chair. "Lieutenant Chen, my client, Seaman Williams, has suffered a serious assault at your hands. He's prepared to file formal charges unless this matter is resolved in a way that acknowledges the excessive force you used against him." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone processed this statement. Captain Rodriguez's expression darkened visibly, while Lieutenant Commander Davis looked like she was suppressing the urge to laugh out loud. Commander Patterson's face remained carefully neutral, but his hands clenched slightly on the conference table. It was Captain Morrison who broke the silence. "Commander Thompson, I think you may want to review the evidence before making threats on behalf of your client. We have multiple witness statements confirming that Seaman Williams initiated physical contact, escalated the situation, and ultimately threatened Lieutenant Chen with a deadly weapon." Commander Thompson waved dismissively. "Witness testimony can be unreliable, especially in a chaotic situation. What we have here is a small woman who somehow managed to injure four larger, stronger men. That suggests either the use of weapons or training that goes far beyond what would be reasonable for self-defense." Captain Rodriguez stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Are you seriously suggesting that Lieutenant Chen should have allowed herself to be assaulted because her attackers were larger than her? Are you arguing that superior training and capability should be considered excessive force when defending against multiple attackers?" "I'm suggesting," Commander Thompson replied coolly, "that there are questions about proportionality that need to be addressed. For men don't end up injured unless someone used more force than the situation required." Lieutenant Commander Davis intervened before the conversation could escalate further. Let's focus on the facts as we understand them. Lieutenant Chen, can you walk us through your decision-making process during the incident? Specifically, what factors did you consider when determining how to respond to each threat? Sarah had been preparing for this question since the incident occurred. Ma'am, my response was guided by standard threat assessment protocols. When Seaman Williams grabbed my shoulder without permission, I used minimal force necessary to break his grip and create distance. When Seaman Morrison attempted to restrain me from behind, I disabled him with a single strike intended to incapacitate without causing permanent injury. She paused to ensure her words were being recorded accurately before continuing. When Seaman Rodriguez attempted to flank me, I used a basic sweep to take him down, again with minimal force. When Seaman Williams produced a knife and threatened me with it, I disarmed him using standard knife defense techniques and applied a control hold until he lost consciousness. At any point, Lieutenant Commander Davis asked, "Did you consider using more force than you actually did?" "Yes, ma'am." When Seaman Williams drew the knife, I could have used lethal force to defend myself. Instead, I chose to disarm and subdue him without causing permanent injury. Every decision I made was aimed at using the minimum force necessary to neutralize each threat as it developed. Commander Thompson scoffed. "You're asking us to believe that you just happened to have the training necessary to defeat 4 men, one of whom was armed, without using excessive force?" Captain Rodriguez's voice was dangerously quiet when he responded. "Commander Thompson, are you questioning Lieutenant Chen's right to possess defensive training? Are you suggesting that military personnel should not be prepared to defend themselves when assaulted?" "I'm suggesting that there are questions about her background that need to be answered before we can properly assess whether her response was appropriate." The room fell silent again as everyone realized that Commander Thompson was fishing for information about Sarah's classified status. He knew, or suspected, that there was more to her story than appeared in her official personnel file, and he was trying to use that information to build a case for his client. Captain Morrison intervened with the authority of command. "Commander Thompson, Lieutenant Chen's personnel file contains all the information relevant to this investigation. Her training background, whatever it may be, does not change the fact that she was assaulted by 4 men, one of whom threatened her with a deadly weapon." Lieutenant Commander Davis consulted her notes again. "Let's review the evidence we have." Multiple witness statements confirm that the 4 male personnel approached Lieutenant Chen's table and surrounded her. Witness testimony confirms that Seaman Williams initiated physical contact. Multiple witnesses saw Williams produce a knife. The physical evidence supports Lieutenant Chen's account of defending herself. She looked directly at Commander Thompson. "Commander, what evidence do you have that Lieutenant Chen used excessive force? What evidence supports your client's claim that he was the victim of an unprovoked assault?" Commander Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The severity of the injuries to my client and his companions suggests that excessive force was used." Captain Rodriguez leaned forward. "Commander, what injuries are you referring to?" "According to the medical reports, Williams has a mild concussion with no lasting effects. Morrison has bruised ribs that will heal completely within 2 weeks. Rodriguez has a minor head injury from falling, and Park is completely uninjured." "Are you suggesting that these minor injuries constitute excessive force when defending against 4 attackers, one armed with a knife?" The weakness of Commander Thompson's position was becoming apparent to everyone in the room. He was representing a client who had assaulted a fellow officer, escalated the situation to include a deadly weapon, and was now claiming to be the victim when his assault had failed. It was not a strong legal position, and everyone present knew it. Lieutenant Commander Davis made this situation even clearer. "Commander Thompson, let me outline what the evidence shows. Your client approached Lieutenant Chen in a threatening manner, physically assaulted her, and then threatened her with a knife. In response, Lieutenant Chen defended herself using minimal force and subdued all threats without causing permanent injury. If charges are filed in this case, they will be filed against your client, not against Lieutenant Chen." Commander Thompson's face reddened, but before he could respond, Captain Rodriguez stood up again. "This meeting is over. Lieutenant Chen acted appropriately in defending herself against assault. Her actions were legally justified, tactically sound, and showed remarkable restraint given the circumstances. He turned to face Commander Thompson directly. If Rear Admiral Williams wants to pursue charges against Lieutenant Chen, he's welcome to do so. However, he should be aware that such action will result in formal charges being filed against his son for assault with a deadly weapon, and conduct unbecoming a naval officer. I suspect that when the Rear Admiral reviews all the evidence, he'll conclude that dropping this matter quietly would be in everyone's best interests. Commander Thompson gathered his papers with obvious frustration. This matter is not closed. My client has rights, and those rights will be protected. After he left the room, Captain Morrison spoke for the first time in several minutes. Lieutenant Chen, from the perspective of this command, you acted appropriately in defending yourself. However, we do have the issue of your operational security to address. Captain Rodriguez nodded. Lieutenant, your classified status has been compromised by this incident. That means we need to make some decisions about your future assignments. Your current mission parameters will have to be reassessed. Sarah had been expecting this conversation since the incident occurred. Sir, what are my options? Several possibilities, Captain Rodriguez replied. We could transfer you to a position where your SEAL status is not classified. We could assign you to training duties where your skills would be public knowledge. Or we could find ways to continue your operational career with modified security protocols. Lieutenant Commander Davis added her perspective. From a legal standpoint, you're in the clear. The evidence overwhelmingly supports your claim of self-defense, and any charges filed against you would be frivolous. However, the political complications created by Williams's father could create ongoing problems. Captain Morrison stood up, indicating that the formal portion of the meeting was concluded. Lieutenant Chen, you'll remain confined to quarters pending final resolution of this matter, but that's purely procedural. We expect this situation to be resolved within 48 hours. As the meeting broke up, Captain Rodriguez approached Sarah privately. Lieutenant, I want you to know that your conduct throughout this incident has been exemplary. You faced a difficult situation and handled it with exactly the kind of professionalism and skill we expect from our special operations personnel. He paused before continuing. There may be some career implications from having your cover blown, but I want to assure you that this incident will not reflect negatively on your service record. If anything, it demonstrates exactly why the Navy invests in the kind of training you've received. As Sarah was escorted back to her quarters, she reflected on the strange turn her career had taken. 24 hours ago, she had been an anonymous officer awaiting her next classified deployment. Now she was at the center of a political and legal drama that involved admirals, lawyers, and competing interests at the highest levels of the Navy. But she had no regrets about her actions. When faced with assault and a deadly weapon threat, she had done exactly what her training had taught her to do. She had protected herself, minimized harm to her attackers, and maintained the kind of professionalism that defined the best military personnel. Marcus Williams and his friends had learned a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had discovered that assumptions about strength, capability, and vulnerability could be not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. They had learned that the most dangerous people are often the ones you never see coming. And, perhaps most importantly, they had learned that actions have consequences, even when your father is a rear admiral. The protection that Marcus Williams had enjoyed throughout his military career was about to evaporate as his superiors realized that his behavior had created exactly the kind of public relations nightmare that the Navy worked very hard to avoid. The next 24 hours would determine the final outcome of the investigation, but Sarah was confident that justice would be served. The evidence was clear, the law was on her side, and she had the support of people who understood what had really happened in that mess hall. Sometimes, the truth was enough. The resolution came swiftly, but not in the way anyone expected. At 0600 the following morning, Sarah was awakened by Master Chief Henderson with news that would reshape everything about the investigation and its aftermath. Lieutenant Chen, he said, his voice carrying an unusual note of satisfaction, you need to get dressed in your dress uniform immediately. You're wanted in the captain's cabin, and you're going to want to hear what's happened overnight. As Sarah prepared for what she assumed would be the final phase of the investigation, Master Chief Henderson filled her in on the developments that had occurred while she slept. "Ma'am, it seems that Rear Admiral Williams decided to conduct his own investigation into his son's claims. What he found was not what he was expecting. The story that emerged was one of spectacular miscalculation on the part of Marcus Williams and his father. Rear Admiral Williams had initially been prepared to use his considerable influence to protect his son and pursue charges against Sarah. But, when he began examining the evidence more closely, he discovered a pattern of behavior that he had been willfully ignoring for years. The investigation revealed that Marcus Williams had been the subject of numerous complaints throughout his naval career, all of which had been quietly buried through his father's intervention. Sexual harassment charges, assault allegations, intimidation of junior personnel, all of it documented but never pursued because of the Rear Admiral's protection. More damaging still, the investigation uncovered evidence that Marcus Williams had been using his father's name and position to avoid consequences for increasingly serious misconduct. He had been operating under the assumption that his family connections made him untouchable, and that assumption had finally led him to target the wrong person. When Sarah entered the captain's cabin, she found herself facing an assembly that included Captain Morrison, Commander Patterson, Captain Rodriguez from Naval Special Warfare Command, and a man she didn't recognize wearing Rear Admiral's stripes. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but not in the way she had expected. Captain Morrison spoke first. "Lieutenant Chen, I'd like you to meet Rear Admiral Williams. He has something he'd like to say to you." Rear Admiral Williams was a man in his late 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in positions of authority. But, as he looked at Sarah, his expression was one of profound embarrassment and what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Lieutenant Chen," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "I owe you an apology. When I first learned of this incident, I was prepared to defend my son without fully examining the facts. I allowed my parental instincts to override my professional judgment, and that was wrong." He paused, gathering himself before continuing. "My investigation into this matter has revealed a pattern of behavior on my son's part that I can no longer ignore or excuse. Marcus has used my position and influence to avoid consequences for conduct that should have ended his naval career long ago." Sarah remained silent, sensing that there was more to come. "I have reviewed all the evidence related to Tuesday night's incident," the Rear Admiral continued. "The witness statements, the medical reports, the physical evidence, all of it confirms that you were defending yourself against assault and a deadly weapon threat. Your response was not only legally justified but showed remarkable restraint given the circumstances." Captain Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair. "Admiral, perhaps you should tell Lieutenant Chen about the other evidence that came to light." Rear Admiral Williams nodded grimly. "Lieutenant, my investigation revealed that Marcus had been planning to teach you a lesson for several days before Tuesday's incident. He had made statements to other personnel indicating that he intended to intimidate you because he felt that women had no place in positions of authority in the Navy." The room fell silent as the full implications of this revelation sank in. What had appeared to be a spontaneous confrontation had actually been a premeditated attack based on gender bias and abuse of authority. Furthermore, Rear Admiral Williams continued, "We discovered that Marcus had been carrying that knife in violation of ship's regulations, and that he had threatened other personnel with it on previous occasions. Tuesday night was not an isolated incident of poor judgment, it was the culmination of a pattern of criminal behavior." Captain Morrison took over the narrative. "Lieutenant Chen, based on this evidence, formal charges have been filed against Marcus Williams and his 3 accomplices. Williams will face charges of assault, assault with a deadly weapon, conduct unbecoming an officer, and conspiracy. The others will face charges of assault and conspiracy." Sarah felt a sense of vindication, but also sadness at the waste of potential represented by 4 young men whose military careers were effectively over because they had chosen to target someone they perceived as weak. "There's more," Captain Rodriguez added. "The Navy has decided that this incident represents an opportunity to address some broader issues about harassment and assault of female personnel. Your case is going to be used as an example of what happens when someone targets our people based on gender bias." Rear Admiral Williams spoke again, his voice becoming even more formal. Lieutenant Chen, on behalf of the United States Navy, I want to apologize for the fact that you were placed in a situation where you had to defend yourself against assault by naval personnel. The behavior you encountered is not representative of our values or our standards. He stood up and moved to face her directly. I also want to personally thank you for the restraint you showed in defending yourself. You could have inflicted much more serious injuries on your attackers, and you chose not to. That kind of discipline and professionalism reflects the highest traditions of naval service. Captain Rodriguez stood as well. Lieutenant, we've also made some decisions about your future assignments. Your SEAL status has been compromised by this incident, but we've decided that rather than trying to maintain your cover identity, we're going to transition you to a training role where your skills can be used to prepare other personnel. Sarah felt a mix of disappointment and relief. Her operational career was effectively over, but she would still be able to serve the Navy in a meaningful way. Specifically, Captain Rodriguez continued, "You're being assigned to the Naval Special Warfare Training Center to develop and implement defensive tactics training for female personnel. Recent events have made it clear that we need to do a better job of preparing our people to handle situations like the one you faced." The assignment was not what Sarah had expected, but, as she considered it, she realized that it might be exactly what she needed. After 8 years of classified operations in dangerous places, the opportunity to train the next generation of naval personnel might be exactly the kind of challenge she was ready for. Captain Morrison handed her a folder containing her new orders. "Lieutenant, your transfer will be effective immediately. You'll be transported to the training center tomorrow morning to begin your new assignment." As the meeting concluded, Rear Admiral Williams approached her privately. "Lieutenant Chen, I want you to know that my son's behavior toward you was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for failing to address his conduct earlier. If there's anything I can do to help your career or to make amends for what you endured, please don't hesitate to contact me." Sarah nodded respectfully. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate the apology, but what happened wasn't your fault. Everyone is responsible for their own choices." Later that afternoon, as Sarah was packing her belongings for transfer to her new assignment, she received an unexpected visitor. David Park, the fourth member of Marcus Williams's group, stood outside her quarters with a nervous expression and what appeared to be a prepared speech. "Lieutenant Chen," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I wanted to apologize to you personally for what happened. I should have tried to stop Marcus instead of going along with him. I was scared and wanted to fit in, but that's no excuse for what we did to you." Sarah studied the young man's face and saw genuine remorse there. Unlike his friends, who had maintained their innocence despite overwhelming evidence of their guilt, David Park seemed to understand the gravity of what had occurred. "Thank you for the apology," Sarah said simply. "That took courage." "Ma'am," David continued, "I know I'm going to be kicked out of the Navy, and I deserve it. But I wanted you to know that watching you that night changed something in me. I've never seen anyone handle themselves the way you did. You had every right to hurt us badly, but you didn't. You could have escalated things, but you chose not to." He paused, gathering his courage before continuing. "I've been thinking about what kind of person I want to be, and I want to be someone like you. Someone who's strong enough to show restraint even when they're being attacked." Sarah was surprised by the young man's words. In all the chaos of the investigation and its aftermath, she hadn't considered the possibility that her actions might have had a positive impact on one of her attackers. "David," she said, using his first name deliberately, "everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you learn from them and how you choose to live afterward." As David Park walked away, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She had joined the Navy to serve her country and test herself against the most challenging training the military had to offer. She had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations, becoming one of the first female Navy SEALs and completing missions that would never be acknowledged publicly. But perhaps her most important mission had been the 45 seconds in a mess hall where she had demonstrated that strength comes in many forms, that assumptions about capability can be dangerously wrong, and that true professionalism means using only the force necessary to protect yourself and others. The next morning, as Sarah boarded the helicopter that would take her to her new assignment, she looked back at the USS Nimitz one final time. The ship looked peaceful in the early morning light, with no indication of the drama that had unfolded in its mess hall just a few days earlier. Master Chief Henderson had come to see her off, and he handed her a letter as she prepared to board the aircraft. "This is from the crew," he said with a smile. "You might want to read it when you get settled in your new assignment." As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah opened the letter and found dozens of signatures from sailors throughout the ship. The message was simple but heartfelt. "Thank you for showing us what real strength looks like. Fair winds and following seas." At her new assignment, Sarah would go on to revolutionize defensive tactics training for naval personnel. Her programs would be adopted throughout the fleet, and thousands of sailors would learn techniques that might one day save their lives. She would never again operate in the shadows, but her impact on the Navy would be greater than anything she had accomplished in her classified career. Marcus Williams and his two friends were court-martialed and dishonorably discharged from the Navy. Williams also faced civilian criminal charges and served 18 months in federal prison. His father's career was effectively ended by the scandal, and he retired quietly 6 months after his son's conviction. David Park was given a general discharge from the Navy but was allowed to avoid criminal charges in exchange for his cooperation with the investigation. He used his second chance wisely, eventually becoming a social worker who specialized in helping young men learn to resolve conflicts without violence. But perhaps the most important outcome of that 45 seconds in the USS Nimitz mess hall was the message it sent throughout the Navy about the consequences of harassment and assault. The story of Lieutenant Sarah Chen became required reading in leadership training programs, and her example helped change the culture that had allowed Marcus Williams to operate with impunity for so long. For men had cornered a woman they thought was weak and defenseless. In 45 seconds, they learned that their assumptions were catastrophically wrong. But, more than that, they learned that in the modern military, there was no room for the kind of behavior they had thought was acceptable. Sarah Chen had defended herself that night, but, in doing so, she had also defended every other service member who had ever been targeted because someone thought they were weak or vulnerable. Her 45 seconds of violence had delivered a message that would resonate throughout the Navy for years to come: underestimate people at your own peril, and never assume that appearances tell the whole story. The most dangerous warriors, after all, are often the ones you never see coming.